You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact.
I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and today I'm hanging out with Dr. Alan Belcher. Alan is an experienced educator, administrator, and consultant, having worked with students in schools at all different levels and in many states and countries. He has held diverse roles in the academy, including teaching, curriculum development, and high-level administration. Currently, he is involved in research to find out what works for students and faculty. And today we're going to be talking about selecting a research method. But before we do that, Alan, I want to welcome you to the show.
Well, thanks, Heather. It's good to be here. I've heard some of your other podcasts, and there's a lot of great information out there for students at all levels to listen to and to take to heart. So very happy to be here with you today.
Well, Alan, thanks for that feedback. And I just want to say you are here based on a recommendation from a faculty member who emailed me and said, you got to get this guy on your show. So for you listeners out there, if you have someone that you'd like to hear on the podcast, let me know and we'll get him on. So Alan, why don't we spend a few minutes you sharing how you got involved in doctoral level research?
Sure. Over the last several years, I've worked with a number of faculty at different institutions trying to solve some problems, address issues. I encourage them at all times to take, well, let's treat this like a research project. Let's treat this as if we were taking this as a dissertation project. What might we do? How would we go about doing that? And, of course, then we'd end up going through all of the basic steps. Let's read and find out what we already know about the problem. What are the questions that we really want to have answered? What's our problem statement? How are we going to collect data? What data is available to us already that we might be able to use, and so on and so forth. So in my time at UAGC, I've had the opportunity to work mostly in the Department of Education and Liberal Arts on research projects, helping them solving some problems. And a lot of times we wanted to focus on what was helping our students. What would be better ways for us to get information across to students? What's a better way to give them feedback? How do we engage them in the discussion forums so that they really get something meaningful out of it? And as a result of that, someone suggested that I might want to work with doctoral students on a more regular basis. So I started doing that just before I ended up retiring from full-time, but I kept doing that because I really do find that terribly, terribly interesting. And in fact, I told my wife at one point, I said, I would, and please don't tell my supervisors this, I would do this if they didn't pay me. I mean, that's how much joy I get from working with students at this level. It's one of those things that I always thought I would do at some point in my career, and now I get to do it. So it's like that old phrase, find something that you like to do and you never work a day in your life. Well, that's where I am right now.
Well, Alan, that's awesome. And your secret is safe with us. I want to start by saying I love that you brought up the structure of a dissertation or a doctoral project is something you could use to solve a problem. And I think sometimes students think, research, right? Because they want to just be out there in the field doing things and making people's lives better. But for those of you who are maybe feeling a little apprehensive about this whole thing we're calling a dissertation, Alan is sharing, hey, yeah, you're going to do this project, but guess what? As you move forward in the world, once you've done this project, it's going to teach you a skill set you can use over and over and over again. And isn't that cool?
Well, that's exactly right. Completing a dissertation, completing a doctoral program, I mean, there's a lot of intrinsic value in that for individuals. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you can prove to yourself you can do this kind of work at this level, and that's important. But the reason we do these things is so that we learn a process for how to address real world problems. And so the skills, the ability to pull other people's ideas together and make sense out of them and apply that to a problem that you're facing in your work environment, whether that's a school or a business or whatever. You have a skill set then that you can apply to whatever comes your way. And that to me is the whole reason for going through this process.
And Alan, as you were speaking, I was recollecting a time I was in a work environment where I was in a meeting and we were trying to solve this problem. And I did what you just described, but wasn't really aware that that's what I was doing, because this way of thinking, this way of being kind of became who I was post PhD. And I actually had someone say, "How did you do that?" And I said, "Do what?" And they said, "How did you think like that?" And I thought, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I guess that's just how I think now. So it really is this skill set that sometimes I think people don't realize they're not just doing this thing, this big, huge task. They're changing how they think. And then once you change how you think, and I know this is going to sound bold, but you can change the world.
And, you change it one piece at a time, or one person at a time, one small issue at a time. That's the way these things work. One of the things that when students are doing their defense of their dissertation, one of the questions that often gets asked is, what did you learn about yourself? Or said another way, how are you now different from when you started? And that question often causes students to stop and, really, I think, reflect for a moment on how they're different. What did I really get out of this process? And the answers are always, always amazing. Things like, I belong, I can do it. I learned that I can persevere. Nothing can hold me back. Just great answers that you hear from. So it is a way of changing how we think and communicate. I think about my own process. I thought I was a pretty good writer. I skated through school, graduate school, no problem. I could write anything they asked me to write until I came up on a dissertation. And then it was a different level. And I had to learn a different way of thinking and putting my thoughts on paper that was at an advanced level, a different level. And I think we all continue to do that. I don't want to say that it's not an important goal to earn your doctorate. Certainly it is. But that's a starting point for then what you're able to do professionally.
People will often say your dissertation is really just your first bit of work that you're going to continue to add to, whereas many students think of it as the last thing they're going to do to get the piece of paper and get the credential, right? But it really is just the beginning. It's just the beginning.
That's true. Very true.
So we kind of went on a little bit of a bunny trail there, which I loved. But before we started recording, we had decided we were going to talk about selecting a research method, because this is such a big issue. And as you were talking about learning different ways of thinking, viewing the world in a different way, research, depending on your discipline, is going to look different. But at some point, you're going to have to pick a research method. And boy, is it interesting how many struggles I see when it comes to this part of the process.
Yeah. And, one thing that I think our students might want to keep in mind is that, now, I don't know about your situation, Heather, but in mine, and I think it's true for a lot of us who are, already faculty members, we have that terminal degree. It wasn't necessarily easy for us either. I mean, we had a struggle. For instance, for me, numbers were always easy. I was pretty good at mathematics through high school and college. I didn't seem to have a problem with that. But at no time did I learn statistics as a class until I was in a doctoral program. So I always knew I was going to do something quantitative. Well, then I got into that statistics nonsense and I said, oh, no, I don't want to do this. Even though I always thought numbers tell a clear story, they really work for me. So I said, okay, I got to go do something qualitative. And when I started looking at the qualitative methods, I think I just started to itch. That was not for me. So I ended up going back to quantitative. And you know what I figured out? That statistics stuff, it's not that complicated. Once you start to understand a little bit about what statistics are and what they tell you and what they don't tell you. So making that choice is not the easiest thing to do. It is important, obviously. But I think that's why it's important to really focus on that problem statement. Because once you have a good problem statement figured out, that sets the stage for everything else that you're going to do. So that problem statement really does set the stage for everything that's going to happen as you go on. So I think that's an important thing for students to think about. One other thing, when you're trying to identify what it is you're going to do for a study, it is not your life's work. When I went to doctoral school, that was like emblazoned everywhere. Your dissertation is not your life's work. So what that means to me then is to accomplish a dissertation, to prove that I have these research skills, I need to identify a problem that's worthy of study, something that is not so large, like I'm not going to cure cancer, I'm not going to end world hunger or anything like that, obvious examples, but something that we don't know the answer to, and something that there's a way that we could at least start to address this issue. And it's not necessarily that my method is going to solve a problem. It's going to address an issue. And I think if our students would think about not solving problems so much as starting to find answers to issues that bother us, that plague us, that we want to know more about, then that helps us to identify the scope of what we're going to be doing. And Heather, how many times do you read a student's paper and say, wow, you got too much going on here. We need to narrow this down. We need to focus this a little. So I think that's a big step, is making sure that you can identify what it is you want to do.
That's true. Alan, you have said so much there that I want to unpack, and you are right. More often than not, I'm saying something like, you have 2 or 3 or 10 dissertations here. What do you say we pick one? And I know the audience, sometimes I wonder if I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but you've heard it here before. Your dissertation or your doctoral project is not your life's work. It is a demonstration project. It proves to the university that you have met the learning outcomes they have set forth for your degree program. And so keeping that scope in mind is important as you're narrowing down and figuring out what this problem is that I'm going to contribute. That's something that I'm often saying. Let's not worry about solving this. This is probably going to take teams of researchers around the world a couple of decades, if not longer, to solve this problem. So let's work on contributing, to the solution. I love that you started with your story about numbers, Alan, because I never cared much for math. I thought it was kind of boring. And then when I got further on in my bachelor's program, I realized the graduate students who knew statistics always had a job, because there's always a line item on the grant for a statistician or a data analyst, right? So I kind of took that away. And when I went to my PhD program, I crossed my fingers that I would like statistics. And I truly felt like I was sitting in a foreign language class. I mean, there's even, Greek letters and stuff, right? But remembering that if I wanted to make sure I was employable, that this was something that I should know, I sat through that class 3 times. It did not come naturally to me. And I think it's important for students to hear this. It's not that, we sit down and everything makes sense. And yes, I see when I would do an ANOVA versus a t-test, and I understand the difference, right? So in my lab, I was studying in a lifespan development lab. And so one of the skills was that you would understand how to take large sets of data from different cohorts and analyze them over time. And so there was no room for qualitative research in my program. And I think it's interesting for the listeners out there to realize that you may think I really want to do this for these reasons, meaning this method. I'd rather work with numbers or I'd rather work with words, which is generally how we divide it, right? But sometimes you're operating within a culture where one or the other is going to be promoted. So that's something to always kind of take into account. This focus, though, on the problem statement, because once you have the problem statement, really, I have often argued your research method almost takes care of itself. And before we started recording, you shared that you have taken upon yourself to create this amazing document. Why don't you talk to the audience a little bit about the decisions you have to make within the two big streams here of quantitative and qualitative, and the things you need to think about in order to make the best decision?
But, it's interesting. I work primarily with students that are coming out of the PhD program in education. And for the most part, the biggest type of study that I see is a qualitative study that we call case study. I'd be willing to bet that almost 50% of what I have seen in the last year have been case studies. And that's fine. There's so many areas that those can apply to. So you mentioned that there's quantitative and there's qualitative. One of the things that kind of intrigues me, and I'm thinking about education as a discipline, is we have so much data on student learning. I mean, we've got test scores, we've got rubrics used on learning outcomes. I can't imagine how many millions and billions of pieces of data we've got on student learning. All of that data lends itself, in my mind anyway, so simply to a quantitative study. I mean, we can measure, how did students last year do? And now we changed the curriculum in this class. We changed the assignments that we were asking students to do. The learning outcomes are the same, but what we're doing with students is different. Are they doing any better now than they were doing before? Our students that are out in, the K-12 system, you've got unbelievable amounts of data on student learning that's available to be used. But within quantitative, there's a handful of different types. There's descriptive statistics. There's correlational statistics. You've got experimental studies that you might want to try to do. There's all different kinds. What's different about them is the different kinds of statistical measures that you use as you go through there, the kinds of questions that you might ask, your research questions or hypotheses. For the most part, we're talking about quantitative type studies. And within the qualitative, where you either talk to people, listen to people, read, all of the documentation that people have created, or you want to talk to experts about an issue and get their consensus on something, or you want to develop a brand new theory that doesn't exist. We don't know why this happens. I want to create a theory. I think I know what's going on here. And all of those are different types of qualitative studies where you are not dealing with numbers so much as you are dealing with the words that people say or they write or think, and you're trying to pull that out of them, make sense out of them in some way. And for each one of those, of course, there's different ways of gathering data. There's different ways of analyzing the data. And I also don't want to leave off one that we see students doing, the systematic literature review, which takes a little bit different process through, chapter by chapter, but it's also a really good one for students to use when there is a bunch of already existing research that needs to be analyzed and reconsidered, put together in different ways to come up with new ideas about whatever the general problem is that all of that research is trying to solve. So, that's a very quick and not very organized discussion of different types of research methods, but, we can talk about any of those that you like, talk about the ones that you're seeing students do, or, whatever makes sense.
Yeah, well, let's start where you did with quantitative. And I want to put a plug out there for quantitative research, because you brought up this idea of archival research using existing data. And I agree. I think it's a shame that there are data sets sitting out there within the university that you're in and elsewhere that are itching to be analyzed. My doctoral dissertation used an existing data set, and, silly me, I thought, oh, this will be faster. And I don't know that there's any fast tracks here, Alan. Sometimes people say, oh, no, numbers. I'm not a numbers person. I'll have to learn so much. It'll take me longer. But let me tell you, qualitative research takes a long time too. I just kind of want to dispel this myth, and I'm curious to see if you think it's a myth too, that one is easier or faster than the other.
Well, it all depends on the individual state. For me, the quantitative better fit my learning style or my writing style to talk about numbers than it did to talk about people's emotions and feelings and thoughts. And that was just like, so to me, so gooey. I don't know that I would have ever survived it. But I gathered some data and used some existing data on student learning. That's why I put in a plug for that. But I'll tell you that once my proposal was approved, 6 weeks later, I was done. Since the data already existed, it was an existing data set. I had got that data pretty quickly, started analyzing it. I was able to run, all the statistical tests that I needed to run on it. And it just did not take me a long time after that. So for me, it was quicker, necessarily easier, but it was quicker for me to accomplish that than to find a group of participants, talk with them, summarize their commentary, either deductively or inductively analyze the commentary. And so I might disagree with you just a little bit. For me, it was easier.
Yeah. Collecting the data is time consuming, whether you're doing interviews or you're trying to get people to fill out your survey, right? You have to allow time for that. And when you're using an archival data set, you cut all that time out because it's already there. Now, for my situation specifically, I was creating mathematical models based on this data set that was fairly complicated, and I had to learn Lizral. And so I didn't plan that I was going to have to learn a software and a program. And so I think, again, what our conversation is showing is that there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of moving parts as you think about the method you're going to use to help contribute to the solving of whatever problem it is that you identified. And I appreciate that you brought up systematic literature view, because more and more this method is being accepted. I see it typically in applied programs. So maybe an EDD, a DBA, a PsyD. For those of you familiar with meta-analysis, instead of just taking effect sizes and coming up with what do we know about the relationship between these variables in terms of the strength of their relationship, the investigator is taking a massive, usually, amount of pre-existing research studies that have looked at this problem and distilling that information into themes to create something new. I didn't know much about it up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It started getting some more play, and I was skeptical at first. I'm like, how is this research? But boy, I am a big fan of the systematic literature view. So if you're in a program where that's an option and you're in an area that maybe feels saturated to you, like there's already been so much research done on this, what could I possibly contribute? Sometimes what you can contribute is pausing and taking stock of what we've learned about this. And that is a huge contribution. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, this comes down to one of the things that I think I learned in my process. 2 things to read. First, I want to read all the stuff that I can find that's pertinent to the topic that I think that I'm settling on for my research. But the second is to read the method. I want to read studies that use the method and I'm thinking about using, even unrelated to my topic, but just so I can see that method in action. If it's a case study, how did this author use the case study to arrive at whatever conclusions, recommendations they've got? If it's correlational, one of the quantitative, how did they use that method? How did they report things? Is that something that's going to work for me? Phenomenology. There's a number of those that come out of the psychology department as well. So you've got to find and read those phenomenology studies. Now, how do you find these? Well, I believe that the chairs are really good resources for that kind. They either have access to or can find those studies that help with that method. And I think it's helpful for students that they get their ideas in front of one of the methodologists as soon as they can. Now, I know when students do their letter of intent or their project justification, I get to be a reader on a lot of those. So, I'm giving them some ideas early on before they even really get into writing the first of their chapters. Here's some ideas about your planned method. Is it going to work? Do we need to tweak that? Had you thought about this kind of method? Might this one be a better approach for you? So, a couple of things that I think is really important for students to know, and not specifically relating to choosing a method, but the chair, the other committee member, the methodologist really are, we're going to hold you to a standard, but we really want you to be successful at this. We want to be able to say, that's one of our graduates right there. And a second thing is the notion of perfection. Don't let perfect get in the way of really, really good. We are looking for students who can put out really, really good research, really clear thinking and communicating. And is it going to be perfect? Maybe not. Maybe that final project will approach perfection, but don't think that it's got to be perfect. Your readers will provide the feedback that will guide you toward that.
Yeah, Alan, I would go so far as to say it's probably not going to be perfect. And the reason for that is because your committee and everyone around you who is supporting you at your university wants you to graduate and doesn't want to keep you here forever, which is probably what it would take to create perfect research. You said something I wanted to talk about, and that is, I hope the listeners are hearing, wow, I have to do a lot of reading before I can make an intelligent decision about my method.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things for me was that I assumed after taking all of the coursework in a doctoral program that I was done with reading all that stuff. I'm ready to write, to do my research project. Well, what I found out was that when you get ready to do a research project is when you really have to start reading. And that's still true when I'm working with a group of faculty and we're trying to figure out what's going to help our students learn better. Man, we got a lot of reading to do. And then we all come back together and we're doing this as a group and we get back together and talk about, well, I found out this and, here's somebody who's got this idea. And, so we collectively do that literature review, which by the way, I have to say is my least favorite part of all of this. Some people thrive on it. I'm not that person, but the reading, understanding what's been done before. I might read an article that solves my problem right away and I don't need to do the research on it. Or I might find a couple of ideas out there that say, we really haven't figured this one out yet. And so it's like, aha, here, I have an idea, an approach that we might be able to use to add some information into that. So I don't know that, well, yes, you can read too much. You got to be judicious in what you choose to read because we just don't have time to read it all. So that's where a lot of the search engines and your library people can really help you identify and find the really good stuff. I mean, these are our experts at organizing information, finding it. Don't hesitate to reach out to them. I know as a faculty member, I do that on a regular basis.
Yes, the library is often an untapped resource. And if you're not tapping into that, we're here to tell you, you are missing out. But Alan, if there's listeners out there thinking, I don't know what I want to do here. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what the best method is. One of the suggestions is do some more reading, some focused reading. Ask the librarian, ask your chair, your committee members to help point you in the direction. It's not enough. I've taught residencies where students will say early on, they're early in their program. They don't even have their problem. I know I'm doing interviews. And I'm like, okay, well, I think it's a little too soon to sign up, but let's say that works out. That's qualitative. What kind of qualitative study, right? It's not always as simple as you think it might be. Like you said, you've taken all these classes. You've passed these classes. You think, here, wait, now I just get to go do this research and write this big paper. But often that's when, and hopefully people think it's fun and exciting, you get to learn the details about a specific method. You get to learn a certain software program, right? You get to learn some more things to make this all come together. Now, we've been talking quantitative and qualitative, and I think it's important to at least on a surface level talk about mixed methods. I know I have an opinion about them, but some listeners might be thinking, I'm going to do both because that's going to be better. Why wouldn't I want to do both?
Well, personally, I have nothing against mixed methods. They serve a great purpose. I understand why we might want to use that, but I really encourage students not to do that because that doubles the amount of work that you've got to do. Not only do I have to now understand and be able to support in writing a quantitative method, I have to do the same for a qualitative method and pull those two together. And then I have to justify, why am I doing them both at the same time? So it adds a lot. Yes, it can produce a fantastic project, but so can quantitative or qualitative by themselves. So I'm not a fan of them for dissertations because just the amount of time that it's going to pile onto the student's work.
I am right with you there. Like doing 2 dissertations, and I will usually encourage students, let's focus on one so that, again, you can create this dissertation that is a demonstration project so that you can get out, right? It's just the beginning of your life's work. And then maybe you'll work with a team of researchers, or you'll be working in a situation where there's not a time constraint, where you're paying every semester for your tuition. And then you can do both. But for now, why not just pick one? I am a big fan of simplicity there.
Yeah. I don't want to see students set themselves up for a project that is going to consume their life for that much longer than it needs to at this point. You've made the point a few times. I think I made it once early on. You are not solving the world's problems with a dissertation. You are demonstrating that you know how to do original research. And once you demonstrate that, then you get on with your life's work and you go solve the world's problem.
You and I could hang out and talk all day. I can just tell. I know the listeners are probably ready to jump into the library and start investigating different methods. I do want to say the document that you put together, I'm going to have available as a link. So for those of you who are thinking, all these different methods are just kind of floating around in my head, and I can't really piece together the different types of data I'd be collecting or the different types of questions or statements I can make based on an analytical strategy. I'm going to have that in the show notes. And thank you, Alan, for putting that together. It's going to be so handy for faculty and students alike. But before we sign off, do you have a favorite quote or some final words of wisdom you want to share?
Well, if you want to call it wisdom, I'm not sure it's that. But for all students out there, all along the way, stop and ask questions. Ask your chair and or committee member. I mean, that's what we're here for. We are here to get answers for you, to guide you. And while I am often the second or the third person to read a document that a student might submit, my feedback will be a little different from the first two that have written. And I know that's confusing sometimes to students. Well, this one said this, that one said that. I don't know that we're going to be at odds with each other, but we are focusing on different parts of the overall project. And so I think it's important before, during, and after you submit a piece of your dissertation study, ask the questions. What questions are on your mind? How can we help? I think sometimes students are afraid to ask. So it's important to develop that relationship with your committee folks that you're comfortable and they know you're comfortable to ask the questions that you feel like you need to ask. And it's the way. That's what we're here for.
We know you haven't done this before, and so we're expecting your questions.
That's right.
Alan, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It was such a joy.
Thank you, Heather. I'm becoming a big advocate for your podcast, and I appreciate that you invited me on.
Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. Until then, if you're looking for more ways to invite joy in your journey, check out the free resources at expandyourhappy.com. You'll find downloads like an article I wrote titled The Doctoral Journey, 12 Things You Need to Know That They Probably Won't Tell You. You'll also find a PDF that organizes all podcasts by the 7 steps detailed in the Happy Doc Student Handbook, which you can also find on the website. Finally, if you're looking for Happy Doc student swag, I've got that too. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and YouTube channel, and if you want to make my day, rate and review so that together we can change the way doctoral education is delivered and experienced. Hey, one more thing. Just a quick reminder that the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only.